It's wonderful to welcome everyone here this evening, whether enjoying the sunshine at Grange Court in Leominster, or for those people who are attending at home via Zoom. We've got a fantastic attendance today. There's over 120 people participating in this John Grove Memorial Lecture. And in particular, it's lovely to welcome Zuza, John's wife, his brother, and other members of his family who are able to be here with us this evening. You are very welcome. As you know, and those of us who knew John were very much aware that although John's life, his professional life, was as an educator and a teacher, his passion was for history, particularly medieval history, but all sorts of history drew his attention. But in all his research, he remained an educator who was passionate about communicating his interest, communicating his enthusiasm and his knowledge, and sharing it with as many people as possible. So following John's sad death 2.5 years ago now, it was fitting, we felt, to rename this lecture, which from its inauguration 6 or 7 years ago had just had the prosaic name of the Mortimer History Society Summer Lecture. It was fitting it be renamed as the John Grove Memorial Lecture, because from the outset, this lecture was very much about bringing to people the highest standards of scholarship and academic research, and making that available to a wider audience. And so wholly in tune with John's whole life and mission. And since the inception of what was the summer lecture and now the John Grove Memorial Lecture, we've been honoured to have speakers such as Professor Chris Given-Wilson, Professor Matthew Strickland, Professor Helen Fulton, Professor Daniel Power, and Dr. David Stevenson. And now this evening, we are hugely privileged that Professor David Carpenter is our speaker this evening. David said to me a short while ago, it will be a quick introduction, won't it? So yes, it will be a quick introduction, because partly, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but I'm sure David needs very little introduction to most of you. Most of you will be familiar with his numerous publications, not least the results of a lifetime's work engrossed in the 13th century, the 2-volume biography of Henry III.
Might say lost it was.
And I was saying to David before, yes, the volumes contain a lot of detail, but out of that detail comes a real sense of someone's life and the mess and the muddle of the reality of life. Too often, from an historian's perspective, we look for rhyme and reason and grand policy and the grand sweep of change. But actually, as we know all too well today, the reality is often muddled and just people making the best of the circumstances in which they find themselves. So who better tonight than to talk about King Henry III and Wales, coexistence rather than conquest. Over to you, David.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. Perhaps as a sort of start and also a sound check, I might say how lucky you are to be here in Leominster in 2024 rather than in 1965, sorry, 1265. Because, as you probably know, in 1265, Simon de Montfort was based in Hereford, and Henry III was his captive, and the Prior of Leicester had to give £200 to prevent his priory and prevent the town of Leicester being burnt to the ground. So at least that's nothing like that is happening on a lovely evening here. So I suppose the question I'm starting with today is, how are we to regard the period of English-Welsh relations in the 13th century, running on down to the conquest of Wales by Edward I? And this is a wonderful picture of Edward I, the conqueror of Wales, from the Sedilia in Westminster Abbey, probably done not long after his death. And he certainly, I think, does look every inch a master and indeed a conqueror. And I'll finish up with a very different picture of Henry III done at the same time. Now, there's a powerful view amongst historians that what happened to Wales, the conquest of Wales at the end of the latter end of the 13th century by Edward I, had long-term causes. It wasn't just simply a product of contingent events. And one aspect of those causes were the attitudes of the English to the Welsh and the view that the Welsh were increasingly barbaric. The other view is that what happened was very much the product of long-term development in the power of the English state. So the demands of the English state were more and more intrusive, more and more abrasive and aggressive. Now, the two historians associated with those views are R.R. Davies, Sir Rhys Davies as he became, and John Gillingham, who you've got up there. Now, John Gillingham, there's a series of articles, I always think the best is called The Beginnings of English Imperialism, developed the idea that these attitudes are becoming more and more hostile to what he termed the, ironically, or the deliberate political incorrectness, the Celtic fringe. Davis's two books on this here, here you see them. On the one hand, Domination and Conquest, the Experience of Ireland, Scotland and Wales, 1100, 1300, and secondly, The First English Empire. Now, the thrust of those books is in a way summed up very well by the title of the first, The Experience of Ireland, Scotland and Wales. What was their experience? The experience was a pretty unpleasant one, faced with all the demands and the power of the English state, and hence the eventual conquest of Wales. Now, I think I'd say in parenthesis here that Rhys, they were great friends, incidentally. Rhys is now dead. John Gillingham still very much alive. We're all gathering in September in Norwich for a symposium in his honour. But they were very different historians. John Gillingham, I always think, was a little bit like his mode of operandi. It was a little bit like the German tanks in 1940, in which you had to press out the thrust as far as you could go and not worry about the flanks. And John Gillingham's a bit like that as a historian, because he develops the argument as far as he can go and often doesn't bother with the qualifications. And sometimes, and I often tell John this, with evidence which cuts the other way, that's either ignored or tipped carefully into the footnotes. Now, Rhys Davies was very different, in a way, more of a Montgomery of a historian, although with wonderful writing style, in that he's always very well balanced. And in both books, you can find the sorts of things I'm going to say tonight about Henry III. But on the whole, the main thrust is very, very clear. And it's, as I said, summed up in terms of the First English Empire, domination and conquest by the English state. Now, the views of Gillingham and Davies have not received universal acceptance. I think one quite good point made about it is that it's a little bit like, whereas the sort of Whig history of the Victorian age looked at the whole of the medieval past in terms of developing the wonderful Victorian constitutional state, so what Davies and Gillingham do is to interpret everything in the light of the Edwardian conquest. So that, and it's in a way perhaps a rather distorting prism. So what I'm going to do is to, well, sorry, just to go on about myself, which you, Philip, right? So I'm going to look at this, obviously, chiefly in the reign of Henry III, 1216 and 1272. And I'm going to say two things. One is that in the reign of Henry III, these pejorative critical attitudes of the English towards the Welsh more or less disappear, and they become much more positive, something Rhys Davies never took account of. I may say I did once go up to Oxford to give a talk about all this, and it was chaired by Rhys Davies. And so I sort of spent the whole time criticising what he was saying. And afterwards he said, "Oh, I can't criticise what Davies said because I'm his host." I thought it was a bit of a chicken out of the way. And I always remember he insisted on walking with me all the way from All Souls College, where the talk was, all the way down to Oxford Station. I always think just to make sure I was quite absolutely out of Oxford. Managed to get rid of me. But anyway, so I'm going to focus on the reign of Henry III, and I'm going to suggest that these pejorative attitudes are no longer there. And also I'm going to suggest that actually the whole long reign of Henry III, 1216, 1272, was in large periods a period of slack in English-Welsh relations, in which Wales was not subject to intrusive, powerful interference, save you could argue for a period in the 1240s by the English state. Indeed, quite the reverse. During this period, there's Henry III, of course, 9 when he comes to the throne. There he is, a little anxious boy being crowned by Archbishop Langton. And here he is, Henry, on his wonderful tomb in Westminster Abbey. So what I'm also going to suggest is that, in fact, who was dominating Wales for much of the 13th century? It was 2 great Welsh rulers, not English rulers. Now, this is where I go to another apology, because I'm hopeless pronouncing Welsh names. And Philip, on driving me here from Hereford, did his best to coach me in various things. But Philip himself admitted he wasn't terribly good at it. And I always remember giving a talk once with Rhys, they may have been the one in All Souls, when I actually spoke about Gwynedd. And he was, I could see the look on his face. I think he thought I was doing it provocatively. Anyway, this was a period when these 2 great Welsh rulers were far more dominant for much of the time than were kings of England. And I suppose to advertise these books, I try to develop that idea in my Penguin History of Britain, The Struggle for Mastery. And equally, in the 2 volumes, Philip was kind enough to mention. Just again, a sort of curious publishing footnote. I mean, these are academic books, I warn you, but they sell modestly well. And it was a curious way, the size altered. So here is the first edition of Henry III, the first volume. And there was some criticism that it masqueraded as a thin book only because the pages were rather thin. So Yale reacted to that, who I may say were wonderful publishers. And the second sort of printing made it much thicker. And that's what Phillips is here. So I imagined that when the paperback came out, it too would be thin, paperback. But no, the paperback was also thick. And then, except now, it's gone over to being thin again. So I never asked publishers what's going on. I just accept it. I'm pleased they're publishing it at all. So there we go. So I suppose obviously the bigger it is, the more lapidary. It will last longer in libraries, but it's also far worse if you want to take it home from a book fair or something. I'm reminded of my father wrote a very big biography of Archbishop Lord Fisher, and someone very unkindly reviewed it, and I think unfairly reviewed it, and said this was a tombstone of a book. And probably could say, look at that. And by the way, this volume 2 is going through the same process. It started thin, it's now got thick, and I'm not quite sure what the paperback will be. So can I come on now to the first part of what I'm going to say, which is the attitudes, after changing, much more positive attitudes of the English to the Welsh in the 13th century. Now, John Gillingham is perfectly right to point out in the 12th century, if you take a chronicle like the Gesta Stephani written in Stephen's reign, how are the Welsh described? They're a barbarous people of untamed savagery. And partly this, I think, was used, there seemed to be a major contrast in economy, culture. Gerald of Wales spoke of the Welsh frugal diet. They ate bread rather than meat. They wore, even the elite wore skimpy clothes. Yet, if we come on to the 13th century and to Matthew, great chronicler of St Albans Abbey, Matthew Paris, writing in the 1240s and 1250s, and here, and I'll show it again later, is a lovely drawing by Matthew Paris of the Welsh prince Griffith ap Llewellyn falling to his death from the Tower of London. But what does Paris say about the crucial point in the 1250s when the Welsh were rebelling against English rule? This is what Paris said. Their cause seemed just, even to their enemies, and this especially comforts them, that they fought constantly in the fashion of the Trojans, from whom they were descended, for their ancient laws and liberties. Oh, miserable English, crushed by aliens and with their ancient liberties extinguished, draw a lesson from the example of the Welsh. So here the Welsh are much better than the English. Now, that wasn't an untypical view. The Tewkesbury Annals said about the Welsh Revolt in the 1250s that they were fighting vigorously to preserve their paternal liberties. The Dunstable Annals thought the revolt was provoked by the attempt to subject Wales to English law. And later, when we come to the rebellion against Edward I, the Dunstable Annals give a full list of grievances of the Welsh, persuading them to rise against Edward I and stand together for their laws. Now, if we ask why was there this change in attitude, I think it's partly the Welsh had gone up in the world thanks to one of the most famous books ever written, and that's Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, 1140s, which of course is the book which invented Arthur. But of course, who were the Britons? They were the Welsh. And of course, where did the Britons come from? They come from the Trojans. And that's why Matthew Paris said the Welsh were fighting in the manner of the Trojans. Now, there's also other factors here. There's a great deal of, by the 13th century, the Welsh elite are looked at very similarly to the English elite. They've got the same armour. Again and again, Matthew Paris describes Welsh rulers as strenuous. Which is sort of an odd word, but it's both martial prowess, chivalric values, and we'll say exactly the same about the English nobles. And of course, that helps to explain the great deal of intermarriage. So your own Ralph de Mortimer marries a daughter of Llewellyn the Great. If you look at the wonderful romance of Fulk Fitzwarren, who was a great marcher baron who rebelled against King John, and there's this romance of his life written in the mid-13th century, how do the Welsh rulers appear there? They appear sporting coats of armour, fighting valiantly with their retinue alongside baronial allies, spending time at the King of England's court as a youth, marrying royal and baronial wives, and indeed in contact with the King of France. So I just can't buy the idea that the eventual conquest of Wales by Edward I was the project of these developing ideas of hostility towards the Welsh. Now, can I come on from now to look at politics of it and the domination and conquest First English Empire hypotheses? And I think it's very difficult to view Anglo-Welsh relations, the reign of Henry III, in that prism. First of all, let's take the first great ruler. Here we have Llewellyn ap Iorwerth, died in 1240, Llewellyn the Great. Now, his relations with England were defined by the treaty which closed the Magna Carta Civil War as far as Wales was concerned, the Treaty of Worcester. And this is where, I'm afraid, those online are not going to get the benefit of the pointer. But if we look at, this is actually a map of Wales in 1267, but it helps. Now, this Treaty of Worcester, in a way, was a triumph. It affirmed Llewellyn's dominance of Wales. Because first of all, the 4 cantrefs up here in the north were ceded to him, and that meant that he'd recovered them from King John. So he's unified the whole of Gwynedd. He also has the whole of southern Powys. He has, on various terms, southern Powys, Kidaway and Kerry. He has part of Builth, and then he has Cardigan and Carmarthen in the south. Now, nothing really disturbed that dominance for the next 22 years to his death in 1240. He was meant to persuade all the other Welsh rulers to go and do homage to Henry III. There's very little evidence that they actually did. The homage of the Welsh rulers is owed to the Prince of Wales, is owed to the King of England as a big bone of contention. He was meant, and this is where, again, the coaching I've had in the car coming here, Minor Nith, which is the Mortimer, of course, based on Mortimer power. He held on to that till his death, although he was supposed under the Treaty of Worcester to give it back, much to Ralph de Mortimer's annoyance. The only real setback occurred in 1223 when William Marshal of Pembroke was able to seize back Cardigan and Carmarthen. But actually, Llewellyn recovered Cardigan in 1231. So let's look now at how did the English government respond to these challenges? Were they trying to push Llewellyn back? Were they trying to assert English dominance over Wales? And so I think we got to first of all take the very first phase of Henry III's reign, which is 1216 to 1234. And it's the period of his minority and its aftermath, where much of the policy was controlled by Great Minister, the Justiciar, Hubert de Burgh. Now, there were 3 campaigns in Wales in that period, 1223, 1231, and 1223, 1227, and 1231. But these campaigns were extremely limited in their objectives. First of all, they didn't in any way try and hit the heart of Llewellyn's power as a ruler of Gwynedd. What they concentrated on was building 3 castles in what's called the Middle March. I think we can see this better in this one. So the first, of course, was at Montgomery. The second was at Hubert's Folly. And the third, further south, was at Payne's Castle. So all they're trying to do is somehow control this area, and also to prevent Llewellyn, establishing dominance down there. Now, the only one of the campaign was a real success, and that did lead to the construction of the castle of Montgomery. The castle of 1227 was immediately pulled down afterwards as part of a settlement, and Payne's Castle, well, it was rebuilt, but it never became a royal castle. It was given to the Tony family, and Llewellyn destroyed it in 1265. So 3 big failures. Let's just look at some nice images of them all. There's the view running along the road to Montgomery, up on the ledge up there. Here's the one, I think that's the view looking north. Wonderful sight, of course. You can imagine Hubert de Burgh, this great castle man, walking over the neighbouring hills, thinking, where should we put it? Here, there. Well, testament, he really found a great spot. Here's some images of the masonry with me, and there's one of me looking, I think, rather dapper. Next is Hubert's Folly, that's the distant view, and there it is, it's a lump on the hill, so pulled down by Llewellyn almost as soon as it was built. Now, I can't do Payne's Castle, I'm afraid, because we were there with my wife many years ago. We did take photographs, we can't find them anymore. So I'm sorry about that. But as I said, then these are very, very limited objective campaigns. And in a way, they're more related, I think, to the ambitions of Hubert de Burgh than of the king, because the ultimate result was that Montgomery, Cardigan and Carmarthen were granted to him in hereditary right. So it's partly building up Hubert de Burgh's power. That all collapsed on his fall. Now, can I come next to the period, the later period, the period of the 1240s, 1250s? As you see, Llewellyn dies at 1240. He's followed by his son, Daffys Death Llewellyn, between 1240 and 1246. Now, this has been seen as a period when a much sharper policy of England develops towards Wales. I think that's true up to a point, but I'm going to qualify it. Now, there was one huge difference between the period of Llewellyn the Great down to 1240 and the period afterwards. And that was, which did enable the kings of England to become more aggressive. And that was because Chester had now come into the hands of the crown. Now, one reason why those early campaigns were all in the middle march and never tried to hit Llewellyn's power at the heart in Gwynedd was because the earldom of Chester was under a friendly earl. And so there was no way that campaigns could reach to Gwynedd because you'd have to go through Chester and you couldn't do that. Now, the last Earl of Chester died in 1237, and I think policy masterminded by a minister called Stephen of Seagrave, it becomes a crown possession. Now, that completely transforms, of course, the ability of kings of England to campaign in the north. Is this getting a bit bouncy? Is it okay? So, okay, the sound. And there were three then campaigns now in the north, 1241, 1245, and 1257. And you could say the result was to replace Llewellyn's dominance with Henry III's. And the final seal was set on that in the Treaty of Woodstock here. Oh, sorry, we'll go back to that later on. Let's go back to some. So under the Treaty of Woodstock, you could see all these nice images again here. Oh, well, let's go. Okay. The Treaty of Woodstock, now the whole of the four cantrefs in the north becomes King Henry's, and it's held down by these two great castles he builds at Deganwy and Deserth. You can see that up the top there. Secondly, at long last, all these areas of Mylianith and all the rest of it here are back into the hands of Marcher barons. And the king also has Cardigan and Carmarthen down here in the south. And also all the homages of the Welsh rulers are now to be the kings, not the Llewellyns. This does seem to fit in much more to the Rhys-Davies picture of it. And there's no doubt, I think that Henry III was proud of his conquests. But if we look at this in more care, as I have done, of course, in volume 1 of my biography of Henry III, I think the picture becomes much more nuanced. First of all, let's look at the situation in 1240 when Daffy Llewellyn's son, succeeds him. Now, it's perfectly true that Henry then insisted that all the homages to the Welsh rulers belonged to him. But at that point, Daffy retains the four cantrefs in the north, so he still has all of this up here. And he's actually recognised as someone of superior status, because according to the Tewkesbury Annals, there was a ceremony at Gloucester where Daffy wore the small diadem, which is called a garland, the insignia of the Principality of North Wales. And on his seal, Daffy shows himself enthroned and holding a sceptre. So there doesn't seem any sort of real hostility to the status of Daffy then. Now, if we come to the campaigns of 1241 and 1245, and I'm not going to go into the detail here, but if you follow the detail, from Henry III's point of view, these are very much the reverse of campaigns of domination and conquest. They are last resorts. Henry seems to be doing absolutely everything he possibly can to avoid them. He hopes that the problems provoking them, in 1241, largely Daffy's refusal to return Mylianith and other principalities and other Marcher territories to the Marcher barons, Henry hopes it can be settled by arbitration and negotiation. Now, in 1241, Rhys-Davies made very much in the final settlement of 1241, he made a lot of what he calls a menacing instrument by which Daffy's humiliation was completed. And this was Daffy's agreement. If he had no heir by his wife, as seemed likely, then Gwynedd, the whole of Gwynedd, was to ask the King of England to finish. And yet what I've argued in a learned article in the Welsh History Review, I think, was that actually this was Daffyd's own idea. And the reason he said, look, if I don't have any children, you can be my heir, was to stop the partition of Gwynedd between himself and his illegitimate half-brother, Griffith ap Llewellyn, who we're going to see in a second. So, it was much more complex than that. Now, can I next come on to the events of 1244, 1245, which again, I think are much more nuanced than you might think. Now, they're provoked by, I'm going to go back all these nice pictures, by Griffith ap Llewellyn's death. So he, after the 1241 settlement, he was taken away and imprisoned by Henry III in the Tower of London. Something, of course, that Daffyd was only too pleased about. So Henry here is doing Daffyd's bidding. But there was always a danger, of course, that Henry might release him and then create division in Gwynedd. So actually, Daffyd was very pleased by this terrible accident in 1244, April 1244, where Daffyd tried to escape from the tower, and you can see the rope breaking, and he was apparently a rather very fat man, as a result, presumably, of a couple of years of comfortable, a lot of money was spent on his upkeep, comfortable living in the Tower of London, and when they found his body in the morning, his head was stoved in. So this was a great moment for Daffyd, because any possibility of rivalry had been removed. And so he immediately started to reverse the verdict of 1241. Now, what was Henry III's reaction to that? It was quite remarkable. When it started in 1244, Henry was actually in the north, and he was urged by his ministers to take the army he had in the north back to Wales and deal with this increasing uprising. He refused to do that. And Matthew Parrish says, swayed by womanly counsels, he went back to the delight and rest of Westminster. So he completely returned his back on the possibility of this Welsh campaign. It doesn't actually start for another year. In March 1245, his Justiciar of Chester, John Lestrange, said that what once could have been done for £1,000 was now going to cost £10,000 because of the delay of doing everything. And that was said, that letter was sent to Henry when he was on pilgrimage in East Anglia. So can we come on now to the situation after Daffyd's death in February 1246? Now, you might think that surely now the King of England, King Henry III, is going to take possession of the whole of Gwynedd. And he had twice over the right to do that. One, because under the 1241 treaty, Daffyd does die with no heirs, so Henry is his heir. And secondly, he's dying in rebellion against the King of England. And actually, we know Henry thought about that because the friendly Bishop of Bangor drew up a memorandum explaining how Gwynedd was twice forfeit now to the King of England. So what does Henry do about it? Nothing. And the closest he got to Wales in 1246 was to get to Woodstock. This despite the fact that one of his most famous household knights had led an expedition through the length and breadth of Wales. So, Henry could have done it then. He had the resources, he had the right. He does nothing. Instead, he prefers to reach this settlement with the two heirs, Owen and Llewellyn ap Griffith, the future Prince of Wales, in the Treaty of Woodstock. And that was certainly an exigent treaty, but in some ways it was less demanding than 1241, because there's no provision in it that if these two Welsh princes die without children, then Henry should be their heir. There is no provision like that. So Henry's contemplating the continuation of Gwynedd as a Welsh principality. I won't say anything about the campaign of 1257. It has been described as the poorest performance put up by any English army in Wales. Henry III abandoned it in September 1257, early in September, on the grounds of the approaching winter. So there you go. So why is it like this? I want to keep a time, wouldn't I, Philip? I'm all right, just raise your hand when I... So why? We need how to go back to Henry himself. Here he is again on his tomb. And I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but I think we know more about what Henry III was like on a day-to-day basis than any other medieval king. And that's thanks to these amazing chancery rolls, which record a high proportion of the letters Henry was issuing on the day. Sorry, am I okay? Right, okay. So what does this material tell us about Henry? In terms of relations with the Wales, the most important thing was he was a rex pacificus, a pacific king. He had no expertise in the business of war and little interest in it, though he sometimes wanted the results of successful war. No evidence he ever attended tournaments. What a contrast to Edward III in the 14th century. He loved hawking, but not particularly interested in hunting, which of course is very close to being a military thing. What these wonderful letters show, because they show where Henry III was on nearly every day of his reign, because they're all dated, place dated, is that he loved a sedentary life. He liked spending his time at his palace and palace castles in the south. So Westminster, Windsor, Winchester, Clarendon, just above Salisbury. Furthest north is Woodstock. And he spends his time decorating them, making them more beautiful, more meaningful. Here's the wonderful, now in the early 19th century, copy of wonderful paintings he had in his great chamber at Westminster. I think we also learn quite a bit from Henry from who was his patron saint. It was, of course, Edward the Confessor, famous pacific king, and the most famous image of the Confessor, which Henry planted, had everywhere in his castles, palaces, churches, is of Edward the Confessor on the right, giving a ring to a pilgrim. There was a numinous episode. It does indeed foreshadow his ascent to heaven. But you can't really compare it, can you, with the person who did become, much to Henry's dismay, if he'd known, England's national saint, St. George. And the famous image of him, of course, is killing a dragon and rescuing a fair maiden from distress. So I think that tells us a lot about what Henry was, that he had a completely non-militaristic patron saint. Henry was also, of course, very involved in doing other things. And again, this takes us back to his piety, his love of Edward the Confessor. And what is he chiefly famous for? Of course, it's building Westminster Abbey. Virtually the whole of the Abbey there, apart from Henry VII's chapel at the end, towers at the other end, is Henry III. All of this is Henry III. That's what he spent his money on, not on great grim castles, which are going to hold down his Welsh conquest. The truth is, the last thing Henry wanted was to have to spend his time on a campaign in Wales. And that was shown very, very forcefully in the one real campaign he led, which was 1245. And that's when he built the great castle at Ganwy. So he did build some castles. It was thoroughly unpleasant. It was cold. Wales lived up to his reputation of being wet. It was cold, wet. The army was starving. A halfpenny loaf of bread went for 5 pence. At one point, there was only 1 cask of wine in the king's household. There was a terrible skirmish in which the Welsh ambushed an English party and in the end executed the nobles, cut up their bodies, and Henry was able to look down at them floating along in the Conwy. So, that's the last thing a king like this wants to put up with. What does he want to do? Of course, as I've said, it's build Westminster Abbey. In fact, that actually impacted on 2 of the campaigns. Why did the 1245 campaign start so late? It was because Henry III wanted to be there for the beginning of the Abbey. Why does he abandon the 1257 campaign? It's because he wants to hurry back for the feast of the Edward Confessor on the 13th of October. So those were reasons why there's very little real vim behind domination and conquest under Henry. But I think there's something more positive just than that. And that is, I think Henry was a king who wanted peace for its own sake. And this runs through a lot of the letters about the various treaties with the Welsh. In 1240, Henry hoped the agreement would be peace, in which England and Welsh would forget, the English and Welsh would forget the homicide, burning, and other evils which they had suffered, and they should become fully reconciled one to another. So in 1247, why does he agree the Treaty of Woodstock and not go on and conquer Wales? It's because he's moved by piety and he wants a concord and perpetual peace. Now, sorry, how long have I been going? What?
You've got number 15.
50 minutes, okay.
15, 20 minutes.
Yeah, quite, that's fine. So can I then, in this context, have a final look, have a quick look at the Treaty of Montgomery itself in 1267? And what's happened between the Treaty of Woodstock, 47, humiliation for Welsh, if you like, and the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267? So rise in the power of Llewellyn ap Griffith. And he's reversed everything which is there in the Treaty of Montgomery. And in the treaty, and he was able to do that in large part because of the English Civil War, the Montfortian Civil War between 1258 and 1265 to 1267. So the Treaty of Montgomery was a huge victory for the Welsh and leads into the period, it both recognises and continues this period of what I talked about, and the real dominant people in Wales are the Welsh rulers. If we look at the map, there is the ford at Montgomery where the negotiations took place. Treaty of Montgomery, and is recognised as, and we'll come back to the papal legate Ottobuono. So here is the map of Montgomery. What does he get? He gets the 4 countries in the north, and he destroys the royal vassals which have been holding them, called Deganwy and Deserth. And you still can see a lot of Deganwy Castle, just the hillocks and humps. And in fact, I once went away, I still have it, it was a stone with a bit of masonry on it, which I picked up, and it now resides in my study. In a very dark day in 1979, I think it was, I rambled all over the hillside at Deserth trying to find the remains of the castle, and completely failed to do it. But actually, you can see bits and pieces of it now online. So Llewellyn gets the 4 countries. He gets this whole area, Kidderwain, Kerry, Bilth. He doesn't get Mailenydd, and I'll come back to that. But all of these rulers here now recognise him as the person to whom they do homage, and Llewellyn is recognised as Prince of Wales. Now, the historian V.H. Galbraith once described Magna Carta as the most fantastic surrender any king had made to his subjects. And in the area of fantastic surrenders, the Treaty of Montgomery surely has a large part. Why on earth have the kings of England basically abandoned the whole policy of the 13th century and given Wales over to the domination of a Welsh prince, who is now recognised as Prince of Wales? Now, obviously, the background, partly historians have said, is exhaustion as a result of the Montfortian Civil War. But I don't think that's at all a sufficient answer, because it would be perfectly possible to continue with truces, which had governed basically the relations of England and Wales in the 1250s and 1260s. Why make a final settlement? Now, one reason for that was certainly money. Llewellyn was giving a large sum of money to the King of England for the treaty. He would have given nothing for a truce. But again, I think it's more than that, because, and this is where I come back to my theme of peace. And that's particularly associated with the papal legate Ottobuono, who really negotiated the Treaty of Montgomery. So what does Ottobuono say about it? Afterwards, he wrote to the Pope explaining what he'd done. And he said, God, looking upon the people of the English and Welsh for so long in discord, is afflicted by many wars, with the eye of his mercy, has banished evil and brought all things into concord. Now that's how Ottobuono sells this treaty to Henry III. And I've said he's a deeply pious man. He's a Rex Pacificus. And he accepts that. He thinks, what a good thing, there should now be peace between England and Wales. And when he gave Ottobuono authority to negotiate the treaty, he said, embracing the ways of peace, after so much contention and discourse, I give you full power to reach a settlement. Now, for Ottobuono, I think, and for Henry, peace is a good thing anyway, but it's also peace for something else, which actually is less good. And that, of course, was to clear the way for the crusade. So peace in England, kings of England, Edward, Henry's son, could go on crusade. Henry is tormented by the fact that he hasn't gone on crusade despite many promises. So I think in a much rather fantastic, unrealistic way, that might have been in the back of his mind. It was certainly at the back of Edward I's mind, who is also, of course, making these concessions, the future Edward I. And we know that from one extraordinary feature of the Treaty of Montgomery, in which all the native Welsh rulers had to do homage to Llewellyn, except for one, who was Maredudd ap Rhys. And the treaty said if the King of England agrees, Llewellyn could buy his homage for 5,000 marks. And that's exactly what happened. Edward sold the homage of Maredudd ap Rhys to Llewellyn for 5,000 marks. Why does he do that? He wants the money for his crusade. And so it's absolutely clear here, isn't it? Absolutely clear that Edward is placing the needs of the crusade far above any future dominance of Wales. Now, so I want to come back to whether the treaty was a good thing or sustainable a little bit. What I want in conclusion, I haven't warned you about this, is to say something about the Mortimers and what they thought of all this. Because after all, you are the Mortimer society. Now, I think this is a bit nuanced. You could argue, and I think truly, that Ralph de Mortimer, let's get them both up here, died in 1246. Roger de Mortimer, 1282, was thoroughly pissed off, if I may use that word, with English royal policy towards the Llewellyns. They thought it was pathetic, and they thought they should have far more support. Now, I think that's completely true of Ralph de Mortimer, who, if you remember, is excluded from Maileanith all the way through from 1240 to 1220, from the Treaty of Worcester in 1218, all the way through to the 1240s. And it's interesting that in that period, he actually married a daughter of Llewellyn the Great. And I think that was almost a humiliating thing for him. It was sort of accepting that I'm not going to recover Maileanith, but I've been given this, a bride instead. Now, what about Roger Mortimer? And incidentally, I'm showing here, I'm afraid it's not terribly exciting, something which I don't think has ever been shown in public at all. It's Roger de Mortimer's seal, and it's the seal attached to the Treaty of Paris of October 1259, in which he, one of the ruling council in England, Louis IX insisted all the councillors sealed the final settlement. And there, from the Archives Nationales in Paris, is my photograph of the, I'm sure an expert would get much better, of Roger Mortimer's seal attached to it. And you can read, you see, Mortem here, Mortimer, just indicating, and you can just about see the coat of arms. So what about Roger Mortimer? Well, I think his view must have been the same, faced by the growing power of Llewellyn ap Gruffudd, who becomes, as we've seen, Prince of Wales in the 1250s. And the one indication of that is that the Revolutionary Parliament of 1258, he wasn't present, although he was placed on the ruling council. He was not present at Oxford for the Great Rebellion in 1258. And I think the reason for that was that he was dealing with the problems now posed by the insurgency of Llewellyn. Now, that reached an even worse climax for Roger in 1263, because at the heart of the rising of Llewellyn in 1263 was the events in, again, Maileanith, because there'd been a rebellion in Maileanith against Roger's rule, and probably fomented, certainly supported by Llewellyn. And the climax came when the Mortimer Castle, I've had coaching on this and I can't remember it, when the Mortimer Castle there was taken by Llewellyn. Now, I've no doubt at all that Roger Mortimer thought, this is just ridiculous. Why am I not receiving more support from Henry III, who's just come back from France, isn't feeling very well? why not getting more support from his son. And of course, Henry is still trying in his usual way to settle it by negotiation. We know that Roger Mortimer was so angry at Henry's efforts to patch up a truce that he actually took Henry's envoy captive for a while. So when we finally get to the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267, Mortimer has jolly well got his bit in it now, and it's the one bit where the King of England doesn't accept what Llewellyn wants, because under the Treaty of Montgomery, Mortimer has Myniaeth again and has the right to build a castle, which presumably meant rebuild the castle at Cefn Lys. So in all these ways, I think Roger Mortimer is very cross with what is going on. And that may explain why he very briefly threw in his lot with Simon de Montfort in 1263, a very uneasy alliance, as I'll come on with the final bit to say. Because you see, what I've talked about so far is only half of what Roger Mortimer is interested in. Yes, he's interested in Wales, but he's also interested in possessions in England and in the Welsh March. And in a very long, exhausting article, I've argued that actually a lot of his conduct in the 1250s and 1260s is actually because of his claim to the Gloucestershire manor of Lechlade, which he thought that the king and the king's brother, Richard of Cornwall, had deprived him of unjustly. And the whole, why was Roger Mortimer, for example, at court all the time, 1259-60? It's because he's launching a great campaign to recover Lechlade in a whole series of litigation. And that was explains why he lost Bilf, because he was at court at Westminster when he was supposed to be defending Bilf. Now, this finally brings us to the great feud with Simon de Montfort, with which I will finish. Now, as I said, the alliance in 1263 between Mortimer and Montfort must have been very uneasy because there was huge tension between them. And that all derived from what happened in 1258. Because in 1258, Montfort has all these grievances against the king and thinks the king owes him a lot of property and money. And the settlement reached in 1259 was that Montfort was given 3 manors in the Welsh March. And you're probably all familiar with them. There they are, Dilwyn, Llagwardine, and Marden. Now, I need hardly ask you, Mortimer people, why was Roger Mortimer so angry about that concession to Montfort? Because, of course, it's bang in the middle. Here's Wigmore up here. It's bang in the middle of Mortimer country. And it got worse than that, because Montfort then, charismatic, powerful, international figure, far bigger in a way than Mortimer, begins to get the allegiances of some of Mortimer's major tenants, one in particular called Henry of Pembridge. So Mortimer is finding his whole rule in the Middle March undermined by Montfort's sudden arrival there. Now, this all reached a climax at the end of 1263, when finally the Lechlade case is settled and Mortimer is now firmly on the king's side. And so what does the king do? Well, actually, I think this is what did Edward do, Henry's son, because it's Edward who wants to prosecute the war against Montfort and not have some kind of settlement. He thinks, I'm going to use Mortimer to actually provoke, outrage Montfort. And so what happened at the end of 1263 was that these 3 Montfortian manors, Dilwyn, Marden, and Llagwardine, are given by the king to Roger Mortimer. Now, Roger Mortimer knows he can't have peaceful possession of them. So what he does is to simply go there and ravage them. And that provokes the great feud between Mortimer and Montfort, which continued in 1264, when I think Lady Mortimer at Wigmore must in some way have been insulted by Simon de Montfort, because, of course, we could come on to Evesham, and again, it's not so far away, it's still on that map. the awful conclusion where Montfort's body is cut up. Incidentally, down the bottom there is the Despencer shield, and that led on to the feud of the reign of Edward II. But there's Montfort's body being cut up at Evesham. Who is supposed to have struck the fatal blow? None other than Roger Mortimer. Who is it who receives the severed head of Montfort? It is, of course, Lady Mortimer at Wigmore, where, according to Robert of Gloucester, when she received the head, she abused it very much. Let's hope she didn't turn it into an inkwell like Queen Victoria is supposed to have turned the Mardy's head after it had been given her by Lord Kitchener. I'm sure that an apocryphal story. So, and then in the settlement after that, who is punished by Mortimer? He's punished Montfort. Henry of Pembridge is punished, and he doesn't get out of Mortimer's jail until he's surrendered Pembridge to him. So, in conclusion here, I think it's a very hard, determined man, but it's not all about Wales, it's about England too. And I think possibly at the end of the day, Mortimer thinks I can look after myself. Now, just a final word before conclusion about the Treaty of Montgomery, peace and so on. And yet, as we all know, it lasts less than 10 years. Now, you might think, and clearly this is what Rhys Davies and John Gillingham think, that there was always a fundamental incompatibility between Henry III's view and Edward's view that, yes, the settlement has made Llewellyn Prince of Wales, but he is still a limb of the English kingdom, still part of England, if one of high status, or part of the, attached to the Kingdom of England. Between that view and Llewellyn's view of his status and claims as Prince of Wales. But I don't think it's necessarily at all like that. As I've said, I don't think the conquest of Wales was prepared for by critical views, majority views about the English towards the Welsh. I don't think it was prepared for by a long history of domination and conquest. As I've said, in Henry's reign, the real people dominating Wales are the two Llewellyns. And I do think there's a lot still to be said for the view of some previous great Welsh historians, Sir Bromley Edwards, that Llewellyn fumbled his way to disaster, and that if he had been more careful, the Principality of Wales might well have survived, and we can but speculate whether that would have been a better future for the Welsh people. Thank you very much. Sorry, I forgot to have the last thing, which is Henry III looking old. So we might as well look at that as I put it up here. Oh, what we go. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm clicking it the wrong way. I'm sorry. Here we go. There we go. So that's the parallel one to Edward I. And obviously Henry's old there, and he's dignified. But I do think that sums up the difference between the two rulers. I mean, there's Edward looking masterful, very, very formidable. And I think that's meant to be blonde hair there, whereas Henry, because he's white hair and so on. So two very different people. So sorry.
Well, thank you very much, David. A fascinating talk. Actually, am I in the? Oh, just check so people can see me. I'm not just a unpersoned voice. That was a fascinating talk, and brought to my mind that one of the favourite sayings of John Grove was that part of the fascination with the Mortimer family of Wigmore and the Marcher lordships was that spanning four or more centuries across the late medieval period, they gave windows into so many aspects of medieval history. And I think we can say very much tonight that David has opened a number of windows into aspects of the relationships between the English crown and the princes of Wales, and indeed the Mortimers across the middle decades of the 13th century. So,
and I ought to say Philip will be illuminating it more, because as you know, he's doing a doctorate on Mortimer.
Thank you. and in terms of your comment earlier about you giving the talk in Oxford, when you were politely disagreeing with Sir Rhys Davies.
It wasn't all that polite.
Oh, I was being polite then, perhaps. But you were disagreeing with Sir Rhys Davies. I have given David notice that there are a couple of things that I'm going to be exploring in my thesis, which may well challenge some of David's conclusions. Now, obviously, I could now spend the rest of the evening asking David questions. But are there any people who have questions to ask, including people at home? If you have any questions, then put them on the chat and we'll read them out. So anybody here? Mike, Mike, I'll bring you the microphone so that people at home can hear, as well as people in this room.
Thank you very much. Do you think that Simon de Montfort's success in recruiting Welsh for his army before Evesham was contributory to Edward's dislike of the Welsh thereafter? Because, of course, the Welsh at Evesham were slaughtered to a man, but they were part of Montfort's power base, and presumably Edward continued to look on them like that thereafter.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'd never thought of that angle before. It's a possible one, and you're quite right, of course, that the Welsh, Montfort had a big Welsh contingent with him at Evesham, and that new account of the battle has them letting out a terrific war whoop as they marched out of Evesham up Green Hill to their deaths. I don't honestly think, though, that influenced Edward very much, because you've got to think the Treaty of Montgomery is after that. And in the Treaty of Montgomery, he does make these amazing concessions, accepts Llewellyn as Prince of Wales. And then, as I've said, equally sacrifices in return for money in the Crusade, the overlordship he could have kept with Maredudd ap Rhys. So I think that if Llewellyn had not been, it's so easy to say, and I remember arguing this with Rhys in a way, Rhys's view was a Prince of Wales has to do what a Prince of Wales has to do, and it behoved his status to behave as he did, which, as you know, was not to pay the money he owed Edward and not to come and do homage to him. I think that just seems so stupidly provocative that Edward was provoked into taking the actions he did. But I'm not sure Edward had those sorts of feelings towards Wales as a whole. He certainly did later on to Daffys, of course, who was executed in the most horrible way in 1282. And that was because Edward thought he'd been betrayed by him. Sorry, I sound very sympathetic toward Edward. I don't feel I much prefer Henry III, and we'd all be a lot better off. I'm sorry, just as a parenthesis, I gave a talk at the Agincourt dinner of the Boas Company last year, and I tried to work out the hypothesis that Henry III was a much better king than Henry V. And of course, he certainly was from the point of view of the general sort of suffering of France and so on. It didn't go down all that well, but by that time they were so sort of well-wined that they just sort of cheered and booed a bit. And so, sorry.
That's fine, thank you. Any other questions? I'll just bring the microphone again.
I noticed Davis emphasised that the English seemed as if they distanced the Welsh from themselves, didn't they? A point he made in his book.
Yeah, I can't remember that particularly. I mean, how in that case to explain the intermarriages? It's an extraordinary thing to think, isn't it, that Roger Mortimer was a grandson of Llewellyn the Great, and that's just one of many intermarriages. So I don't really see that. I also have huge respect for Rhys Davies, and I think he writes beautiful English. And doubtless also wrote beautifully Welsh because he also spoke English.
And
From your map, did the Welsh border go as far as Worcester? It looked as though it was the west of the River Severn.
So did what go as far as Worcester?
The Welsh border.
No, it didn't. It would be much further to the west.
although,
Philip.
one thing we have to remember that, of course, in this period there wasn't a Welsh border.
No.
There wasn't a defined border between England and Wales until the Laws and Wales Acts during the reign of Henry VIII in 1536.
I mean, yeah, I think that's a very good point. I go back to the maps. I mean, what we basically have is a division between, on the one hand, under the Treaty of Montgomery, you've got Welsh areas under the overlordship of Llewellyn. And then you've got, which not really in Wales, or are they in Wales, March baronies, which I suppose are part of Wales here, but there's no defined border. Where does Offa's Dyke run? I'm not sure.
Roughly from just to the east of, or just round about Disseth, and down to the Severn estuary,
Yeah, but it would be
at Chepstow.
a long way west of.
But Offa's Dyke was never intended as a boundary. As those of you who were at our conference in May will have heard Keith Ray saying that Offa's Dyke served a number of functions, but was not a boundary, and the boundary between England and Wales was always fluid, and with the March, you have a border region, and it wasn't, as I said, until 1536 that the border was defined between England and Wales. One last question. Right, shall I let you read that, and Ed, as you're closer than Clive will?
The one online is from John, who asks, do you think if Daffyd ap Llewellyn had lived, he would have continued to fight and Henry would have been driven to conquest?
Well, you see, I don't think you mean this is Great, isn't it, presumably? But I don't think there was until Llewellyn the Great's death in 1240, there was no attempt to disturb his hegemony in Wales. The only thing Gillingham sometimes said in a rather pathetic way is, look, the homages the Welsh rulers belong to me, not to you, and made efforts to stop Llewellyn taking their homages. But I mean, down to Llewellyn's death in 1240, there was nothing particularly for him to fight about. Does Ian want to ask a question?
I mean, I can ask a question. There's been one in my head, which is basically, we often free.
Well, Ian, just wait a second, because otherwise the Toad won't hear you.
Sure. So over the period, we often treat church and state as two separate functions. Now, Henry, of course, was a king that often tried to marry those functions with the amount of pilgrimage he wanted to do, the amount of benefactor he was to monastic sites. Do you think that there is perhaps a way of looking maybe at the church in Wales as something as well? Because it's later on when you get John Peckham, who comes through and deals with the Welsh on behalf of Edward I, and with Daffys then. That happens. Is there anything similar in Henry's reign?
Sure. I think attitudes were fundamentally changed by the 1282 war and the treachery of the Welsh as Edward and churchmen saw it. Until then, I don't think it was like that necessarily. And I quoted those ecclesiastic annals, the Dunstable annals, who take a very sympathetic view of the early phases of the revolt against him. And of course, later about in the 1240s, 1250s, the Bishop of Bangor is often in exile at St Albans and clearly telling Matthew Paris a lot about Wales, and of course taking a rather sympathetic view to England's the King's claims. So I think it is quite diverse, but I think that would be a very interesting thing to investigate. Philip, did you want to ask a question?
There's a number, but one I think was just whether you could comment a bit more on. I mean, you've just mentioned that, of course, Roger Mortimer was the grandson of Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, which means, of course, that he was first cousin to Llywelyn ap Gruffydd.
Yeah.
And do you think that relationship influenced Roger, and being half Welsh, influenced Roger Mortimer in his approach to Wales?
What I think those show is that my point about the cultural homogeneity of the period, that these great French Welsh rulers and the great English marcher barons, they sort of have a community of interest, a community of culture, which enables that intermarriage. I don't think, though, that necessarily mean that Roger Mortimer necessarily had kindly feelings to Llywelyn ap Gruffydd when he attacks Meilinid. And of course, family relationships can create harmony, and they can create terrible discord, as Henry III's relations with his brother-in-law showed only too clearly.
And because one thing that's interesting is that we had a seminar, which some of us were at a couple of weeks ago, led by Dewey Alter, where he was looking at 16th century historians and how they portrayed the Mortimers.
Yeah.
Humphrey Lloyd,
that's very interesting,
who describes Roger as the true heir to Gwynedd.
Really?
Because Llywelyn, his father being Griffith, the illegitimate son of Llywelyn ap Iorwerth.
Yeah.
Whereas, there was a view that, of course, Gladys Thea was the daughter of Llywelyn and Joan, the legitimate daughter of King John.
So
so therefore Roger was actually the legitimate heir to Gwynedd.
So we now have another one. If only Roger had lived, he might have been able to press that claim. I think knowing whatever the first was like, he would have got absolutely no at all.
No, but I've certainly not come across any suggestion that was considered in the 13th century, but could be a factor in why the royal family kept Roger close.
Yep.
So anyway, I think it's probably the right time to finish. Just if I can just go through the slides quickly.
I'm sorry, they're very amateurish slides. Many people are much. That looks awful.
Yeah. So anyway, but just before I just make a couple of announcements, if we just give our thanks again to David for a fascinating evening.